Have you ever wondered what kind of power could change the fate of one of the greatest empires in history, yet remain hidden behind silk curtains and marble walls? Behind the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, stretching across 3 continents, lay a world that was never meant for outsiders. A place where beauty, politics, and ambition collided. A place where whispers could shape wars, and a single woman could sway the destiny of millions. This was the Imperial Harem, not merely a collection of women, as many imagine, but a political machine, a school of survival, and a battlefield without swords. Tonight, we open the gates of Topkapi Palace. We step past the golden doors and into the shadows where the Sultan ruled the world, but the harem ruled the Sultan. Backhand index pointing right in the next chapter, we'll meet the figures who truly gave life to this hidden empire. The mothers, wives, and concubines who rose from captivity to command kings. When we speak of the Ottoman harem, the image that often comes to mind is one of beauty. Graceful women draped in silk, their eyes lined with kohl, their laughter echoing through marble halls. But the truth of the harem was far more complex. These women were not merely ornaments. They were students, strategists, mothers, and in some cases, rulers in all but name. The women of the imperial harem came from every corner of the empire and beyond. Many were not Ottoman by birth. They were captured in wars, gifted as tributes, or purchased from distant markets. A young girl from the Caucasus might be taken from a mountain village. A Christian from the Balkans might find her fate tied to the empire she once saw as an enemy. A beauty from the Mediterranean coast could be sold into the household of the Sultan. In this gilded prison, their lives were transformed, often brutally, but sometimes gloriously. Yet despite the chains of their beginnings, the harem was not just a cage. For many women, it was a ladder, a place where intelligence, charm, and ambition could lift them higher than they ever imagined. To rise within the harem was to play a game of survival, where every gesture, every glance, and every whispered word could mean the difference between obscurity and influence. At the very heart of this world stood the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. She was the ultimate figure of authority inside the harem. Her son might sit on the throne, but she often pulled the strings. She commanded the eunuchs, oversaw the training of the concubines, and even advised on matters of state. In the Ottoman hierarchy, after the Sultan himself, the Valide Sultan was often the most powerful person in the empire, but she was not alone in shaping the court. Around her swirled countless others. The concubines chosen to serve the Sultan's needs, the favorites who caught his eye, the consorts who bore his children, and the princesses who secured alliances through marriage. Each woman had a role, each carried influence, and each was a piece in the grand chess game of empire. Life inside the harem was meticulously structured. A new girl would first serve among the lowest ranks, performing menial tasks. If she showed talent, whether in music, dance, conversation, or even politics, she could be promoted. Training was rigorous. The young women were taught the Ottoman language, etiquette, poetry, and the arts. They were prepared not just to entertain, but to influence. Among these ranks, some would rise to become the Sultan's Hasiki, his favorite consort. To be chosen was to step into a world of both danger and privilege. The Hasiki Sultan might sleep in gilded chambers, wear jewels imported from Venice, and sit beside the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth. Yet with each honor came risk, for rivals never rested. Envy was a constant companion, and behind every smile could lie a blade sharpened by ambition. Then there were the princesses, daughters of the Sultan himself. Their marriages were not matters of romance, but of politics. Each union forged alliances, bound powerful families to the throne, and extended the Sultan's influence. To marry a princess was both an honor and a burden, for it tied the groom's fate irrevocably to the palace. And surrounding them all were the black eunuchs, men who guarded the harem, ensuring its secrets never spilled into the outside world. They were both protectors and enforcers, serving directly under the authority of the Valide Sultan. To defy them was to defy the will of the empire itself. But perhaps the most remarkable truth of the Ottoman harem is this. Though it was a place of confinement, many of the women within it became some of the most educated, cultured, and influential figures of their time. They were versed in politics, economics, and diplomacy. They were patrons of the arts, builders of mosques, and founders of schools. Through their influence, entire cities were transformed. Consider this. The Sultan commanded armies, but it was often his mother, his wife, or his favorite who whispered in his ear before he made a decision. Wars were fought, treaties signed, and ministers dismissed, all under the unseen hand of women within the harem. The harem was not just a palace of beauty, it was a palace of power. Each woman was a thread in a vast tapestry, and together they defined the very character of the Ottoman dynasty. Some of them are remembered as saints, others as schemers. But all of them, in their own way, left an indelible mark on history. And so, as we step deeper into this hidden world, we must ask, what did it truly mean to be chosen as the Sultan's favorite? How did one rise from obscurity to stand at the side of the most powerful man in the empire? That is the story we turn to next. In the glittering labyrinth of the imperial harem, to be seen by the Sultan was both the greatest honor and the gravest danger. Out of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women, only a handful would ever catch his eye. And among those chosen, even fewer would ascend to the coveted position of Hasiki Sultan, the Sultan's favorite, his confidant, and in many ways his equal in power. But how did a girl, often brought into the harem as a slave or captive, rise to this extraordinary height? The path was never simple and never safe. It was a journey of transformation, calculated charm, and ruthless survival. From captive to contender, most girls entered the harem as outsiders. A daughter of a peasant from the Balkans, a Circassian beauty taken in a raid, or a Venetian girl sold into slavery. Suddenly, she would find herself within the ornate walls of Topkapi Palace. At first, she was nobody, a nameless servant dressed in plain cloth, tasked with cleaning chambers or carrying water. But the harem was more than a prison. It was a finishing school designed to mold these young captives into refined women of the court. They were taught Ottoman Turkish, poetry, calligraphy, and song. They learned to walk with grace, to speak with elegance, and to conceal their emotions behind a veil of mystery. The eunuchs and older concubines drilled them in etiquette, how to bow, how to serve, how to hold their gaze just long enough to intrigue, but never long enough to offend. For many, this training was a preparation for a lifetime of service within the palace. But for a select few, it was the first step towards something far greater. The Sultan's gaze, the moment of destiny, often came suddenly. A girl might be dancing in a ceremony, playing the oud, or simply walking through the gardens when the Sultan's gaze lingered. That single look could change everything. Overnight, she might be summoned from her modest quarters and presented before him, her life instantly elevated above the rest. But a look was not enough. To become the favorite, she needed to hold his attention, to charm not just his eyes but his mind and spirit. The Sultan was not merely a man of desire. He was a ruler burdened by the weight of empire. He sought solace, companionship, and, above all, someone who could share his vision or soothe his anxieties. The girl who could speak intelligently, who could recite poetry, who could offer laughter after a day of council meetings. Such a woman stood apart from the rest. Beauty opened the door, but wit and wisdom kept it open. The trials of a favorite, once a girl, entered the Sultan's private circle. Her life became both exalted and perilous. She was adorned with silks and jewels, escorted by eunuchs, and given chambers near his own. Her name was whispered in the halls with envy and fear, but with each privilege came risk. Other women watched her rise with sharp eyes. Rivals plotted in silence, some willing to poison food or spread rumors to tarnish her standing. The higher she climbed, the more treacherous the ground beneath her feet became. Surviving in this world required more than beauty. She needed allies among the eunuchs, favor with the Valide Sultan, and the ability to anticipate every shift of power within the palace. One wrong word, one moment of arrogance, and she could be cast aside or worse, disappeared into the shadows of history. Love or power. Historians have long debated whether the Sultan's favorites were truly loved or merely used as pawns in the grand machinery of politics. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Some favorites undoubtedly shared genuine affection with the Sultan, their influence rooted in intimacy and trust. Others, however, saw their role as a calculated climb, their hearts hardened by the knowledge that survival depended on maintaining favor at all costs. One striking example is Hürrem Sultan, perhaps the most famous of all the Sultan's favorites. Brought from Ruthenia as a slave, she rose not only to capture the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, but also to wield power as his legal wife, an unprecedented honor in Ottoman history. Her story illustrates the extraordinary heights a favorite could achieve, transforming from a captive girl into one of the most influential women of the empire. Bearing in heir the greatest weapon of a favorite was not her beauty, nor her wit. It was her womb. To bear the Sultan a son was to secure her place in the palace. A concubine who gave birth to a prince was no longer just a companion. She became the mother of a potential ruler. Motherhood elevated her status, placing her under the protection of the Valide Sultan and surrounding her with servants and tutors dedicated to the child's upbringing. But motherhood also drew her deeper into the deadly game of succession. For every prince was a possible heir, and for every heir, there were rivals whose survival depended on eliminating him. Thus, to be the mother of a prince was both a blessing and a curse. It gave her leverage over the Sultan, but it also painted a target on her back. The price of favor for the chosen few who became favorites. The harem was both paradise and prison. They dined on delicacies, wore emeralds and rubies, and moved through the palace with authority. Yet they lived under constant surveillance, their fates tied to the whims of one man. Some favorites grew old in luxury, their names remembered in poetry and song. Others vanished suddenly, victims of intrigue or replaced by fresher faces. The harem was merciless, rewarding brilliance but never forgiving weakness. And still, the pursuit of favor never ceased. For as long as there was a sultan, there were women willing to risk everything for a chance to stand beside him. The making of a sultan's favorite was not merely a story of love or desire. It was a story of survival, of ambition, and of the relentless pursuit of power cloaked in silks and smiles. To be chosen was to ascend beyond imagination, but also to step onto a knife's edge where one misstep could mean ruined. In this hidden world, women did not simply wait for destiny. They shaped it with every breath. And yet, even the most powerful favorites still lived in the shadow of one figure who towered above them all, the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. To understand the true engine of power within the harem, we must now turn to her story. If the Sultan was the sun around which the empire revolved, then the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, was the moon, casting her light and shadow over every corner of the palace. She was the most powerful woman in the Ottoman world, and in many ways, the most influential political figure after the Sultan himself. The title Valide Sultan was not merely ceremonial. It was the culmination of a lifetime of survival, strategy, and often heartbreak. To become Valide Sultan meant that a woman's son had ascended to the throne, and with his coronation, she herself stepped into an unparalleled position of authority. In a world where women were often hidden from public life, the Queen Mother became the exception. A woman who could bend ministers to her will, direct the affairs of state, and in some cases, even decide the fate of wars. From concubine to Queen Mother, every Valide Sultan began her journey as a concubine. Once, she too had been a girl brought into the harem, trained, tested, and chosen. She had risen above her rivals not only by catching the Sultan's eye, but, most crucially, by bearing him a son. That son was her greatest weapon, her shield, and her key to immortality within the palace. When the Sultan died and her son inherited the throne, the former concubine was no longer just a mother. She became the mother of the Sultan, the living embodiment of legitimacy and dynastic continuity. In the eyes of the empire, she was untouchable. But this transformation was not without danger. To reach the position of Valide Sultan was to have survived the most perilous gauntlet of Ottoman succession. Princes often perished in the deadly struggle for power, as brothers competed for the throne. For a woman to see her son succeed was to outlast rivals, to protect him from assassins, and to weave alliances strong enough to support his claim. By the time she became Valide Sultan, she was already a seasoned strategist. Power beyond the curtain, the Valide Sultan's chambers and Topkapi Palace were as grand as her authority. Decorated with intricate tiles and gilded calligraphy, her apartments were the center of the harem's administration. Eunuchs reported directly to her. The entire hierarchy of concubines fell under her command. Even the Sultan himself, though absolute in theory, often sought her counsel. Her influence extended far beyond the palace walls. The Valide Sultan received foreign ambassadors, corresponded with rulers of other nations, and allocated immense funds for charitable works. Mosques, schools, hospitals, and fountains across Istanbul and beyond bear the inscriptions of Valide Sultans, testifying to their role as patrons of the empire's cultural and spiritual life. In practice, this meant that the Queen Mother was often a co-ruler. She controlled appointments to high office, managed relationships with the janissaries, and sometimes dictated the policies of the empire. Ministers knew that to defy the Valide Sultan was as dangerous as to oppose the Sultan himself. The shadow of the throne historians sometimes refer to the 16th and 17th centuries as the Sultanate of Women, a period when Valide Sultans and powerful favorites dominated the politics of the empire. This was not hyperbole. At times, the Sultan was a young boy or an inexperienced ruler. It was his mother who effectively governed his place. One striking example is Kösem Sultan, who served as Valide Sultan to not one, but two sons, and later even as regent for her young grandson. For decades, Kösem was the most powerful figure in the Ottoman Empire, orchestrating politics, forging alliances, and even commanding executions. Her word carried the weight of law, and her reach extended into every sphere of Ottoman life. But her story also reveals the dangers of power. Kösem was eventually strangled in her own chambers by rivals who feared her influence had grown too great. Her death was a brutal reminder that even the Queen Mother walked a perilous path. Balancing the harem and the state, the Valide Sultan's power was not limited to politics. She was also the arbiter of life within the harem. She decided which concubines would be presented to the Sultan, which women would be promoted, and which would be married off to powerful officials. By controlling access to the Sultan, she controlled the very heart of the empire. This role gave her immense leverage. A single recommendation from the Queen Mother could elevate a family from obscurity to prominence. Likewise, her disfavor could doom a rival to exile or disgrace. In many cases, she used this authority to strengthen her own network of loyalty, ensuring that her family and allies dominated court politics. Yet, her responsibilities also carried a maternal dimension. The Valide Sultan was expected to embody dignity, wisdom, and compassion. Through her charitable foundations, she built mosques that still stand today, endowed schools that educated generations, and provided for the poor in a way that reinforced the legitimacy of the dynasty. The double-edged sword of power. Despite her unrivaled position, the Valide Sultan's life was fraught with danger. Her power made her the target of endless plots. Courtiers, viziers, and even her own daughters-in-law could become enemies. In the ruthless world of Ottoman politics, loyalty was rare and betrayal was constant. Moreover, her greatest strength, her son, was also her greatest vulnerability. If he died young, was overthrown, or proved weak, her own position could collapse overnight. The fate of the Valide Sultan was always tied to the fate of her child. Still, those who navigated these dangers successfully became legends. Their names are etched into the very stones of Istanbul, their stories preserved in chronicles, and their legacies remembered as proof that power in the Ottoman Empire was not only wielded by men. The rise of the Valide Sultan reveals a paradox at the heart of the harem. A place designed to confine women became the very stage upon which some of them shaped the destiny of an empire. From the shadows of captivity, They emerged as sovereigns in all but name. And yet, while the queen mother commanded respect, the world within the harem was never free of rivalries. For beneath the silks and jewels, ambition burned fiercely. Concubines, favorites, and even princesses fought for influence, each hoping to carve their place in history. In the next chapter, we will step into that world of jealousy and intrigue, where alliances were fragile and the rivalry of women could be as deadly as the clash of armies. The imperial harem was often called the Golden Cage, but it was a cage filled with fire. Behind its jeweled doors, beneath the perfume of roses and the music of lutes, there existed a constant, simmering struggle for survival. This was no place of sisterhood. It was a battlefield disguised in silk. Every woman in the harem, from the lowest servant to the most exalted favorite, understood one truth: power was finite. Only a handful could rise, and for one to ascend, another had to fall. Beneath the layers of elegance and ritual, rivalry festered like an open wound, sometimes erupting into open conflict, and at other times, festering in whispers that could prove more lethal than daggers. The seeds of jealousy was the lifeblood of the harem. Imagine, hundreds of women, each trained to perfection, each dreaming of the sultan's gaze, yet knowing that only a few would ever be chosen. Every smile carried suspicion, every gift was weighed for hidden meaning, and every glance was a silent contest. To become the sultan's favorite was not only to gain riches, but also to gain enemies. Other women, once allies in the long climb through the harem's ranks, could transform overnight into rivals. Friendships were fragile, betrayal was common. A whispered rumor could destroy reputations. A poisoned sweet or a tainted cup of sherbet could end lives. Alliances in the dark survival demanded cunning. Women within the harem learned quickly that isolation meant death. They built alliances, sometimes with each other, often with eunuchs, and most strategically, with the Valide Sultan herself. Eunuchs were especially powerful allies. They moved freely between the sultan's chambers and the harem, carrying messages, favors, and sometimes secrets. A concubine who secured the loyalty of a eunuch could use him as her eyes and ears, learning of plots before they struck or ensuring her rival's schemes were exposed. The Valide Sultan, too, played a decisive role in these rivalries. She encouraged some women, suppressed others, and ensured that her own influence always remained supreme. By choosing which concubines were presented to her son, she effectively controlled the battlefield. Many women sought her favor, offering loyalty in exchange for protection. But her support was never free. It always came with strings attached. Rivalries turned deadly. The stakes were too high for rivalry to remain harmless. Throughout Ottoman history, the harem witnessed countless tragedies born of jealousy. One tale speaks of a concubine who had risen swiftly, capturing the sultan's affection with her wit and grace. Her rival, unable to tolerate her success, arranged for her food to be laced with poison. The favorite fell gravely ill, and though she survived, the suspicion of treachery lingered. The accused concubine was never seen again. Some say she was strangled, others claim she was drowned in the Bosphorus, her silks dragging her to the depths. Such stories were not anomalies. They were the rhythm of life in the harem. For every woman who rose, another vanished into silence. The golden walls of Topkapi concealed not only laughter and music, but also cries that never reached the outside world. The role of the prince's rivalries extended beyond the women themselves to the children they bore. For every concubine who produced a son, her status increased dramatically. But that elevation came with mortal danger. The Ottoman system of succession was notoriously brutal. Brothers were seen not as family, but as rivals for the throne. The concubine who bore a prince knew that her child's survival depended on eliminating his competitors. Mothers schemed to advance their sons' positions, forming alliances with powerful viziers, bribing eunuchs, and undermining the mothers of other princes. It was a cruel truth. The cradle and the grave were never far apart in the Ottoman dynasty. To be the mother of a prince was to live in constant fear. fear that another woman's son might rise, and with his rise, her own son might meet an untimely end. Hidden wars of influence. Not all rivalries were fought with poison or daggers. Many were battles of influence, waged in the Sultan's private chambers. A favorite might use her beauty, her intelligence, or her skill in conversation to steer the Sultan's decisions. Another might commission poetry or music that echoed her virtues, ensuring her name was whispered in every corner of the palace. Some women turned to faith and charity, establishing mosques or fountains in their names, weaving their presence into the very fabric of Ottoman society. By aligning themselves with the religious establishment or the people of Istanbul, they built reputations that even rivals within the harem could not easily tarnish. But these acts of influence were not merely personal. They had political consequences. A concubine who won the Sultan's ear might sway him toward war or peace, toward alliance or betrayal. Behind every imperial decision, one must ask, was it the Sultan's will or the whisper of a woman in his bedchamber? The price of victory in the rivalries of the harem often came at a terrible cost. To win was to survive, but it was also to live in constant vigilance. A woman might climb to the pinnacle of power, only to spend her nights wondering who plotted against her. Some favorites, weary of endless intrigue, chose to retreat. After bearing a son, they requested to be sent away with him to a provincial palace, far from the poisonous air of Topkapi. There, they lived in quiet comfort, away from both power and peril. Yet most women stayed, driven by ambition, unwilling to surrender the game even when the price was blood. The harem was a paradox, a place of beauty and art, yet also of rivalry and death. Its women adorned themselves with jewels, but the sharpest weapons they carried were invisible, smiles that concealed venom, words that could ruin reputations, and alliances that could vanish overnight. The rivalries of the harem reveal its true nature, not merely a house of pleasure, but a crucible of politics, a hidden court where the empire's fate was shaped as much by whispers as by swords. And yet, the rivalries within the harem were not isolated. They intertwined with the politics of the empire itself. For the harem was not simply a private world. It was a weapon of the Ottoman state, a tool wielded as much in diplomacy as in domestic power. That is where our story turns next, to the harem as a political weapon, shaping the empire in ways the outside world could scarcely imagine. From the outside, the harem appeared to be a secluded sanctuary, locked away from the world of politics and power. Yet for those who understood the true machinery of empire, the harem was far more than a private refuge of the Sultan. It was a tool, a living, breathing weapon, wielded in diplomacy, governance, and the control of society. The Ottoman harem was not simply a collection of women. It was an institution designed to consolidate authority, neutralize threats, and shape the very structure of the dynasty. Each concubine, each prince, and each alliance forged through the harem carried weight in the destiny of the empire. The symbol of sovereignty for the Sultan, the harem was a symbol of sovereignty. Only the ruler of a vast and powerful state could command such wealth, beauty, and obedience. To foreign ambassadors, glimpses of the harem, rare though they were, demonstrated the Sultan's magnificence. The very existence of such an institution was propaganda, proof that the Ottoman ruler was not just a man, but a sovereign above all others. Tea ceremonies. When women of the harem appear behind veils, their elegance and mystery reinforce the aura of the Sultan's supremacy. Even unseen, they projected power, their presence a reminder that the dynasty was perpetuated through them. Marriage as diplomacy. Although sultans themselves rarely married foreign princesses, preferring concubines who were entirely dependent on the throne. Their daughters, the Ottoman princesses, were key players in political strategy. Through carefully arranged marriages, the empire secured alliances with powerful families, military commanders, and provincial governors. To marry a princess was not only an honor, but a political contract. It bound ambitious men to the dynasty, ensuring their loyalty. These marriages extended the Sultan's influence across the empire, creating networks of allegiance that strengthened his grip on power. Meanwhile, the mothers of these princesses, the concubines who had once been rivals in the harem, gained political clout as their daughters forged new alliances. Thus, the harem functioned as a diplomatic bridge between the palace and the wider empire. The princes and the politics of succession. Perhaps the most significant political function of the harem was the production of heirs. Each concubine who bore a son altered the balance of power within the palace. A single birth could shift alliances, spark rivalries, and even ignite wars of succession. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide, the practice of new sultans executing their brothers to prevent civil war, made succession a deadly affair. The harem became the stage upon which these struggles were prepared. Mothers fought fiercely for their sons, maneuvering to ensure that their child would one day inherit the throne. The Valide Sultan, standing above them all, used these rivalries to her advantage, balancing factions to maintain her own authority. Through the princes, the harem was inseparably tied to the politics of the empire's future. Influence over the sultan beyond dynastic concerns, the women of the harem often influenced the sultan's personal decisions, decisions that shaped imperial policy. A whispered word from a favorite could tip the balance in a council debate. A story told in private could sway the sultan toward mercy or vengeance. Critics of the Ottoman court sometimes accused the harem of corrupting the sultan, portraying him as a ruler distracted by women while the empire weakened. Yet this view overlooks the sophistication of the harem's influence. Many of its women were educated, politically astute, and deeply aware of the needs of the state. Their counsel, far from frivolous, often guided the empire toward stability. Hürrem Sultan, for example, famously corresponded with European monarchs, acting as an informal diplomat on behalf of Suleiman the Magnificent. Her letters reveal a sharp political mind, one capable of engaging with rulers on matters of war, peace, and alliance. Patronage and public image. The harem's power extended beyond the palace through patronage. Valide sultans and powerful consorts financed mosques, schools, hospitals, and fountains, embedding their influence in the daily lives of the people. These projects were not only acts of piety, but also tools of political legitimacy. When the people of Istanbul drank from a fountain built by the Queen Mother, they were reminded of her generosity. When they prayed in a mosque she endowed, they felt her presence woven into their faith. In this way, the harem reached into the streets of the empire, shaping public perception of the dynasty. Foreign perceptions to outsiders. The harem was a source of fascination and fear. European envoys often wrote about it with a mix of awe and suspicion, portraying it as both exotic and dangerous. They recognized that while they could negotiate with the sultan and his viziers, the true influence sometimes lay with unseen women behind veils. This perception itself became a political tool. Rumors of the harem's influence spread across Europe, fueling both admiration and propaganda. The idea that women could steer the destiny of the Ottoman Empire blurred the lines of gender and power. Shocking foreign courts where queens and consorts rarely wielded such open authority, a double-edged sword yet. The harem, as a political weapon, was a double-edged sword. Its power strengthened the dynasty, but also created vulnerabilities. When factions within the harem grew too strong, they destabilized the court. Rivalries between mothers of princes sometimes spilled into open conflict, weakening the unity of the state. Historians debate whether the Sultanate of women contributed to the eventual decline of the empire, but what is certain is that the harem was inseparable from Ottoman politics. It was not an isolated world of leisure. It was the pulse of the dynasty itself. The harem as a political weapon reveals the paradox of Ottoman power. Behind the image of a single absolute ruler lay a complex web of women, eunuchs, and alliances, each shaping decisions that reverberated across continents. But politics was only one dimension of life within the harem. Beneath the diplomacy and intrigue, there were also human stories, tales of love, betrayal, and blood. These were the dramas that made the harem not only a political institution, but also a theater of passion and tragedy. And that is where we turn next, to the love affairs that shook the palace, the betrayals that ended in blood, and the human cost of power in the gilded cage. If the harem was a palace of power, it was also a stage for passion, and passion, in the world of the Ottoman court, could never be separated from danger. Love in the harem was never simple, never pure. It was entangled with ambition, shadowed by rivalry, and haunted by the ever-present threat of betrayal. Behind the perfumed curtains and marble corridors, moments of tenderness unfolded. A stolen glance, a secret smile, a whispered word shared by candlelight. But these fleeting sparks of intimacy were kindled in an environment where love could elevate a woman to glory or plunge her into ruin. The illusion of romance from the outside, it was easy to imagine the Sultan surrounded by women who adored him, his life an endless dream of beauty and desire. But in reality, love inside the harem was a delicate illusion. For many concubines, affection for the Sultan was less about passion than survival. To win his attention meant freedom from obscurity, a chance at influence, and perhaps the hope of bearing a prince. But for the Sultan himself, affection was equally complicated. Amid the weight of empire, he craved not only beauty but also companionship, loyalty, and understanding. In rare cases, true love seemed to blossom. The bond between Suleiman the Magnificent and Hürrem Sultan is one of history's most enduring examples. Suleiman broke centuries of tradition by marrying her, elevating a former slave girl into his legal wife and queen. Their letters, preserved to this day, speak of tenderness and devotion. And yet, even their romance was not free of suspicion. Many whispered that Hürrem used her love to control Suleiman, steering him against rivals and securing the succession for her sons. The poison of jealousy where love existed, jealousy followed close behind. A favorite who captured the Sultan's heart became the envy of all others. Rivals schemed, whispering slanders, weaving lies, and sometimes resorting to lethal means to reclaim the Sultan's gaze. Poison was the most feared weapon. A sweetened sherbet, a plate of figs, even a touch of coal to the eye could conceal death. Rumors spread of favorites struck down suddenly, their beauty fading in fever as rivals watched in silence. Whether all these tales were true or born of gossip hardly mattered. The fear was real, and it gnawed at every woman who rose too high. But betrayal came not only from rivals. Eunuchs who served the women might switch loyalties for gold. Ministers outside the harem might plot to remove a favorite whose influence threatened their own. Even the Sultan himself could turn cold, casting aside a woman who had once been the center of his world. The blood of succession, the darkest betrayals of the harem, were not between women, but between mothers and sons, brothers and blood. The Ottoman system of succession demanded that only one heir survive to rule. Brothers were not siblings in the harem's cruel arithmetic. They were enemies. A concubine who bore a prince was thrust into a deadly rivalry with every other mother of princes. Her child's survival meant another's death. Some mothers whispered to their sons to trust no one, not even their half-brothers. Others risked everything to eliminate rivals before their own child was targeted. When a new sultan ascended the throne, the palace often echoed with grief as his brothers were executed to secure his rule. Behind those executions lay years of silent struggle within the harem, where mothers fought not with swords but with alliances, bribes, and intrigue. The sorrow was unbearable. Women who had once shared laughter were forced to watch their sons' lives cut short. Love turned to hatred, motherhood to a battlefield. In the harem, the cradle was never far from the grave. Stories of passion and death history records many tales where love, betrayal, and blood entwined in the harem. Take the story of Valide Sultan, the first beloved of Suleiman. For years, she held his affection and bore him a son, Mustafa, who was admired as a promising heir. But the arrival of Hürrem changed everything. Mahidevran and Hürrem became bitter enemies, their rivalry spilling into open hostility. In the end, Hürrem's influence prevailed. Suleiman ordered the execution of Mustafa, a decision that shocked the empire. Love and jealousy had rewritten the line of succession, changing the course of history forever. Or consider Kösem Sultan, who navigated decades of power, mothering multiple sultans. Yet even she was betrayed. After years of dominance, her own daughter-in-law, Hürrem Sultan, turned against her, fearing that Kösem would replace her son with another heir. One night in 1651, Kösem was strangled in her chambers, her long reign ending in blood. These stories remind us that the harem was never simply a place of romance or leisure. It was a crucible where human passion collided with dynastic survival, producing tales as tragic as any battlefield. The dual nature of love in the harem could not be separated from power. It could lift a woman from slavery to sovereignty, or it could cast her into oblivion. It could inspire grand mosques and works of art, or it could drive the sultan to order executions that haunted him until death. For the women, love was both a shield and a sword. To love the sultan was to gain protection, but it was also to expose oneself to rivalries more dangerous than any war beyond the palace walls. Even for the sultan, love was perilous. To give his heart was to risk being swayed, manipulated, or betrayed. Yet he was still a man, vulnerable to affection, yearning for companionship in the lonely weight of empire. The harem's stories of love, betrayal, and blood remind us that history is not only made in council chambers or on battlefields. It is also forged in private moments, moments of desire, jealousy, and desperation that shape the fate of millions. But while individual stories stir our hearts, two women stand above all others, their names etched into the very fabric of Ottoman history: Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan. They were not only lovers and mothers, but architects of empire, their power unmatched by any woman before or after. And so, our journey continues to the lives of the most powerful women of the Ottoman harem, whose legacies still echo in the stones of Istanbul. Among the countless women who passed through the gilded gates of the Ottoman harem, two names rise above all others, etched into both legend and history: Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan. They were not merely favorites of their sultans. They were strategists, patrons, and rulers in their own right. Women who transformed the harem into a center of imperial power and reshaped the Ottoman Empire itself. To speak of them is to step into the heart of the Sultanate of women, the century in which the harem's influence spilled openly into the politics of empire. Hürrem Sultan, the slave who became a Queen Hürrem story, begins far from Istanbul. Born in the early 16th century, likely in what is now Ukraine, she was captured during a Tatar raid and sold into slavery. Her beauty and intelligence brought her to the Ottoman palace, where she was trained in the ways of the harem. To most, she would have been just another concubine, destined to fade into obscurity. But fate had other plans. She caught the eye of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's most powerful sultan, and their bond quickly deepened. Unlike many rulers before him, Suleiman was not content with fleeting passion. He found in Hürrem a partner who matched his intellect and shared his ambitions. Breaking centuries of tradition, Suleiman married Hürrem, elevating her from slave to legal wife. The move shocked the court and scandalized foreign observers. But the Sultan's devotion was unshakable. Through marriage, Hürrem became not just his consort, but his queen, something unheard of in Ottoman history. From her new position, Hürrem wielded extraordinary influence. She bore Suleiman multiple sons, securing her role in succession politics. She corresponded with European monarchs, including the Polish king, acting as a diplomatic bridge between empires. She also sponsored charitable works across Istanbul, commissioning mosques, baths, and soup kitchens that still bear her name. But her rise came at a cost. Her rivalry with Mahidevran Sultan, Suleiman's earlier consort and mother of his son Mustafa, became one of the most infamous feuds in Ottoman history. Mahidevran's son was long seen as the heir, but Hürrem maneuvered tirelessly to secure the throne for her own children. The climax of this struggle came with the execution of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son and a beloved figure among the army. Many whispered that Hürrem had poisoned the Sultan's mind against Mustafa, convincing him that his son was plotting rebellion. Whether true or not, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's death. The empire wept, but Hürrem's sons now stood closer to the throne. That Hürrem's life was a testament to resilience, strategy, and ambition. She transformed from a captive girl into one of the most powerful women in the world. Her legacy etched into the skyline of Istanbul and the lineage of the Ottoman dynasty. Kösem Sultan. The mother of sultans. If Hürrem broke tradition, Kösem Sultan expanded it to its furthest limits. Born Anastasia, a Greek Christian, she was brought to the harem as a young girl, where she converted to Islam and was renamed Kösem. She first rose as the favorite of Ahmed I, whose love for her was deep and enduring. Kösem bore him multiple sons, and with their births, her position within the harem strengthened. But her true power emerged not as a consort, but as a mother. When Ahmed died young, Kösem's role as Valide Sultan, the queen mother, catapulted her into the center of politics. Over the course of her life, she would serve as Valide Sultan to not one, but two of her sons and a grandson, making her one of the longest-serving and most powerful women in Ottoman history. Kösem was cunning, pragmatic, and ruthlessly effective. She navigated turbulent times, marked by weak sultans, military revolts, and shifting allegiances. During the reign of her young son Murad IV, she acted as regent, effectively ruling the empire in his name. Even as Murad matured into a fearsome ruler known for his strict laws and military campaigns, Kösem's influence remained. She was celebrated as a protector of the empire's stability. She mediated between factions, calmed rebellions, and ensured the dynasty's survival during periods of crisis. But her power also drew enemies. Her later years saw a bitter rivalry with Hürrem Sultan, her daughter-in-law, and the mother of her grandson Mehmed IV. Fearing that Kösem would depose Mehmed in favor of another heir, Hürrem plotted against her. In 1651, after decades of dominance, Kösem's story ended in betrayal. She was strangled in her chambers by eunuchs loyal to Hürrem. The death of Kösem marked the violent close of an era, but her legacy as the most enduring woman of the Ottoman harem was sealed. Two queens, two legacy Hürrem and Kösem were very different women. Hürrem's power came through her unprecedented marriage and her influence as Suleiman's partner. Kösem's strength lay in her longevity and her role as Valide Sultan, guiding multiple generations of rulers. Yet both women shared traits that define the sultanate of women: intelligence, ambition, and a capacity to wield power in a world that sought to confine them. They were masters of survival, shaping dynastic politics not through armies or swords, but through strategy, diplomacy, and maternal influence. Their legacies live on not only in the palaces they inhabited, but in the mosques they built, the endowments they left, and the history books that remember their names alongside the greatest sultans. The paradox of power. The stories of Hürrem and Kösem reveal a paradox. The harem, seen by outsiders as a place of seclusion and passivity, was in fact a crucible of leadership. These women did not merely survive, they thrived, bending the rules of empire to their advantage. They remind us that power is not always where we expect to find it. Sometimes it lies not in the council chamber or on the battlefield, but in whispered words, private letters, and the embrace of a mother guiding her son toward the throne. With Hürrem and Kösem, the harem reached the height of its political influence. But just as their power illuminated the empire, their struggles also revealed the dangers of ambition and rivalry. As the 17th century wore on, the balance began to shift. The harem, once the empire's hidden engine of power, started to transform again. Its role questioned, its influence contested. But before we move to that decline, we must look at the everyday reality of those who live behind its gates. Beyond queens and favorites, what was life truly like for the hundreds of women who never reached such heights? For all its legends of power and intrigue, the Ottoman harem was above all a place where hundreds of women lived their lives, most of them far from the throne, their stories unrecorded. Behind the tall palace walls, the daily rhythms of the harem unfolded like the beating of a hidden heart, blending routine, ritual, and rare moments of joy. It is here, in the everyday details, that the harem sheds its veil of mystery and reveals itself As both a sanctuary and a prison that a world within walls, the harem was not just a single chamber, but an entire palace within the palace. It occupied vast quarters of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a labyrinth of marble corridors, gilded rooms, tiled halls, and shaded courtyards. To enter its gates was to step into a world sealed from the city outside. For the women who lived there, the harem was both home and cage. They rarely, if ever, left its confines. Instead, their world was defined by its inner spaces, the dormitories where they slept, the training halls where they practiced their skills, the baths where they cleansed and relaxed, and the gardens where they caught fleeting glimpses of the sky beyond. The structure itself reflected hierarchy. The lowest-ranking concubines slept in large communal rooms. Higher ranks enjoyed more privacy, their chambers decorated with silks, carpets, and small luxuries. At the very top, the Valide Sultan and the Hasiki had lavish apartments, rivaling even those of the Sultan himself. The training of women life for a new concubine began with training. Upon arrival, a girl was often frightened and bewildered, ripped from her homeland, stripped of her past, and thrust into a strange new life. She was given a new name, often of Persian or Arabic origin, marking her rebirth into the Ottoman world. She then began years of education. Language was essential. Ottoman Turkish became her tongue, while she might also learn Arabic for religious purposes and Persian for poetry. She was taught the arts of refinement, how to sing, play instruments, dance, recite poetry, and engage in elegant conversation. She studied embroidery, calligraphy, and the rituals of court etiquette. This training was not frivolous. It was preparation for survival. To rise within the harem, a woman needed to be more than beautiful. She needed to be graceful, intelligent, and captivating. Those who excelled could advance to serve the Sultan directly, while others remained in lesser roles. Ritual and routine the day in the harem followed a carefully structured rhythm. At dawn, the call to prayer echoed through the chambers, marking the beginning of devotion. Women washed, prayed, and then began their duties. Meals were served communally, though the quality of food reflected rank. While lower concubines ate simple dishes of bread, rice, and stew, favorites dined on delicacies brought from across the empire. Pomegranates from Damascus, fish from the Bosphorus, sweets drenched in honey. Afternoons were often filled with lessons or practice. Music drifted through the halls as young women rehearsed their instruments. In another chamber, tutors instructed girls in literature or recitation of the Quran. Some women tended to embroidery, their hands weaving intricate patterns in silks destined for the Sultan's chambers. Leisure existed too. The harem baths were places of relaxation and socialization, where women soaked in warm pools, shared gossip, and indulged in scented oils. Gardens offered rare moments of fresh air, where one could walk beneath cypress trees or watch the Bosphorus from latticed windows. But every routine was shadowed by hierarchy. A woman might serve tea to her superiors or bow when passing the chambers of the Valide Sultan. Obedience was not optional. It was survival. The guardians of silence overseeing this daily life were the eunuchs, particularly the black eunuchs who guarded the harem's gates and corridors. Their presence was constant and formidable. They carried not only keys to the harem, but also the authority of the Sultan himself. For the women, eunuchs were both protectors and overseers. They ensured that the harem remained sealed from the outside world, but they also reported misconduct, enforced rules, and sometimes acted as intermediaries in secret communications. In many ways, the eunuchs held the delicate balance of trust and fear that kept the harem functioning. Rare privileges and dreams, though most women never met the Sultan, hope lingered. Every concubine dreamed of being chosen, for such a moment could change her life forever. The Sultan's visits were unpredictable. He might pass through the halls, casting a glance that could elevate a girl to glory, or leave her waiting in silence for years. For those who never caught his eye, another fate awaited. Once their youth faded, many women were married off to officials, soldiers, or court servants. In this way, The harem supplied brides loyal to the dynasty, spreading its influence throughout the empire. For some, it was liberation, an escape into a new life. For others, it was simply another form of duty. Between luxury and loneliness, daily life in the harem was a paradox of splendor and confinement. Surrounded by jewels, silks, and perfumes, the women lived in material luxury. Yet, emotionally, many faced crushing loneliness. Separated from their families, forbidden from the outside world, they often longed for freedom. Friendships blossomed, but could never be fully trusted, for rivalry lurked beneath every smile. Some women turned to faith, finding solace in prayer. Others immersed themselves in art, poetry, or music, creating beauty to ease their sorrow. The harem was a world of contradictions, both a prison and a palace, a place of opportunity and despair. For every Hürrem who rose to power, hundreds of unnamed women lived quiet lives, their stories forgotten, their voices lost in time. The human side of the harem, when we peel back the layers of legend, daily life in the harem reveals the humanity of its women. They were not only concubines or schemers, but individuals, daughters, sisters, and mothers, caught in a system larger than themselves. Their laughter filled the gardens, their tears stained the marble floors, their prayers rose with the dawn. In their silence and resilience, they gave the harem its heartbeat, sustaining an empire's private world for centuries. But while daily life gives us empathy for the women behind the veil, it also forces us to ask a larger question. What became of the harem in the later years of the empire? Did this institution of beauty and power continue unchanged? Or did time and politics transform it forever? For centuries, the Ottoman harem stood as a symbol of power, mystery, and influence. It was the heart of the empire's private world, where women shaped dynasties and whispered counsel into the ears of sultans. Yet, like all institutions bound to time, the harem too faced change. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it no longer resembled the gilded cage of Suleiman's day. Instead, it transformed slowly, sometimes painfully, as the empire itself declined. The waning of the Sultanate of Women the 16th and early 17th centuries marked the height of the harem's political influence, the so-called Sultanate of Women, when figures like Hürrem and Kösem wielded extraordinary power. But as the Ottoman state shifted, so too did the balance of authority. By the late 1600s, grand viziers, powerful ministers appointed by the Sultan, began to dominate governance. They commanded armies, oversaw administration, and increasingly sidelined the palace women. The harem still existed, but its influence on policy diminished, and no longer were Valide Sultans the driving force of empire. Instead, they became symbolic figures, respected but rarely feared. The great dramas of succession grew less bloody, and the empire sought stability in tradition rather than risk in female power. The shadow of decline as Ottoman power receded in Europe and Asia, the harem became a target of criticism. Reformers within the empire, as well as European observers, blamed the harem for weakening the state. They claimed that indulgence, corruption, and intrigue distracted rulers from their duties. Pamphlets and chronicles denounced the decadence of the palace. Satirists painted lurid images of idle sultans lost in luxury, while their viziers shouldered the burden of rule. The harem became a symbol of decline, a convenient scapegoat for the empire's military defeats and economic struggles. But this image was only partly true. While the harem was indeed a world of seclusion and ritual, it was no more corrupt than other institutions of the empire. In fact, many of its women continue to sponsor public works, mosques, and schools well into the 18th century. Yet perception, once cemented, is hard to erase. The impact of westernization in the 19th century brought dramatic change. As the Ottoman Empire sought to modernize in the face of European pressure, the palace too began to adopt Western customs. Nowhere was this more evident than in the reign of Sultan Abdülmecid I, 1839 to 1861, who moved the court to the lavish Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus. The new palace reflected Western tastes. Crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and European furniture filled its halls. The harem, once cloaked in Oriental mystery, began to absorb these influences. Women wore Western dresses alongside traditional kaftans, played the piano in addition to the oud, and learned French as well as Persian poetry. Education within the harem expanded. Princesses and elite concubines studied not only religion and art, but also modern sciences. Some were even allowed to read newspapers and discuss politics, bridging the old traditions with new ideas. The harem was no longer a timeless institution frozen in ritual. It was evolving, reshaped by the currents of modernity. The changing role of women with westernization came new opportunities. By the mid-19th century, Ottoman princesses began to play more visible roles in society. They attended public ceremonies, supported charities, and even published poetry. Their presence outside the palace walls contrasted sharply with the strict seclusion of earlier centuries. The harem itself grew less central to politics. The sultan still maintained concubines, but his relationships were more private, less entangled in dynastic struggles. Marriage became increasingly common, with sultans choosing legal wives rather than relying solely on the concubine system. By the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, 1876 to 1909, the harem had become a quieter institution, still luxurious, still guarded, but no longer the crucible of political intrigue it once was. The fall of the empire and the end of the harem, the final transformation, came with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. In 1924, the newly founded Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolished the Sultanate and exiled the last Ottoman family. The harem, once the beating heart of imperial power, was dissolved. The women of the palace were given choices: to leave for exile with the dynasty or to remain in Turkey, often stripped of wealth and privilege. Many faded into obscurity, their once gilded lives reduced to memory. The rooms of the harem in Topkapi Palace, once filled with whispers and footsteps, became silent. Today, they are museums, visited by tourists who walk among tiled walls and marble fountains, imagining the lives of those who once lived there. Legacy of transformation. Though the harem as an institution ended, its legacy persisted. For centuries, it had been a crucible of culture, producing women who were patrons of art, architecture, and charity. The mosques and endowments they left behind still serve communities in Istanbul and beyond. In popular imagination, the harem remained both myth and reality. Painters of the 19th century depicted it as a place of sensuality, reinforcing Orientalist fantasies in the West. Writers spun tales of intrigue and passion. Yet, for modern historians, the harem is remembered as a complex institution, part household, part school, part political arena. Its decline and transformation remind us that no institution is eternal. Even the most powerful symbols of empire bend to the weight of time, politics, and social change. From its dazzling rise under Suleiman to its quiet fall in the shadow of Ataturk, the Ottoman harem traced the arc of the empire itself. Magnificent in its glory, complicated in its politics, and human in its decline. But even as its walls fell silent, one question lingered. What lessons remain from this hidden world of women and power? What values, legacies, and warnings does the harem still whisper to us across the centuries? As the final curtain falls on the story of the Ottoman harem, one truth becomes clear. It was never just a place of beauty, nor merely a cage of desire. It was a world where power, culture, and humanity converged. To understand the harem is to understand the Ottoman Empire itself, not in marble palaces or battlefields, but in the hidden lives that shaped its destiny. The dual image of the harem for centuries, the harem has lived in two worlds, one of fact and one of myth. In Western imagination, fueled by Orientalist painters and writers, it became a fantasy of silken couches, languid women, and sensual indulgence. These images of odalisques reclining in exotic chambers captured European fascination, but they obscured the deeper reality. Within the empire, the harem was remembered differently. It was a household of discipline, hierarchy, and education. It was a sanctuary where women were trained not just in beauty, but in intellect, faith, and refinement. And at its height, it was a seat of power where women shaped politics, patronized art, and guided the fate of sultans. The truth lies between these extremes, a place of both splendor and sorrow, opportunity and confinement, luxury and loneliness, a legacy of women's power. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the harem is the power of its women. Figures like Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan remind us that influence is not always loud or visible. Their voices echoed not in battle cries but in whispered counsel, not in parliaments but in private chambers. And yet, their decisions altered the course of history. Through them, we see how women navigated a patriarchal world, finding paths to authority even within walls meant to contain them. They were strategists, diplomats, and patrons whose legacies endure in Istanbul's mosques, fountains, and charitable foundations. Their stories challenge us to reconsider the way history remembers women, not as shadows behind men, but as architects in their own right. Cultural and artistic contributions. The harem's influence was not only political, it was cultural. The women of the palace were patrons of art, music, poetry, and architecture. Their endowments enriched the empire's cities, while their tastes shaped Ottoman aesthetics. From the delicate tiles of Topkapi Palace to the grandeur of the Haseki Sultan Mosque, their mark remains visible. They also foster traditions of poetry and music within the palace. Some women wrote verses of their own, while others sponsored artists whose works still resonate. In this way, the harem was not just a private domain, but a cultural engine, radiating beauty beyond its walls. Lessons from the harem. What lessons does the harem offer us today? First, it reminds us of the complexity of power. The sultan may have worn the crown, but influence flowed through many unseen channels. In the Ottoman court, as in life, power was never absolute. It was negotiated, shared, and contested, even within the harem's confines. Second, it reveals the resilience of human spirit. Many of the women who entered the harem did so unwillingly, taken from distant lands. Yet some transformed their fates, rising from slavery to sovereignty. Their stories are ones of survival, adaptation, and ambition. Finally, the harem speaks to the paradox of freedom and confinement. Behind its locked gates, women lived in luxury but longed for liberty. Their experiences remind us that wealth and splendor cannot erase the human need for choice and autonomy. The echoes in modern Turkey today, the harem lives on not as an institution, but as memory and heritage. Visitors to Topkapi Palace walk through its silent halls, tracing footsteps across marble floors once filled with laughter, prayers, and intrigue. They peer into chambers where queens once slept, courtyards where concubines trained, and fountains where whispers of love and rivalry once flowed. In modern Turkey, the harem has become a subject of fascination, scholarship, and even entertainment. Television dramas retell the lives of Hürrem, Kösem, and others, bringing their struggles and triumphs to new generations. Historians sift through records, separating fact from legend, giving voice to women once silenced. The harem has become more than history. It has become a mirror, reflecting questions of gender, power, and cultural identity that remain relevant today. The final question as we close this journey, one question lingers. Was the harem ultimately a place of oppression or empowerment? The answer, perhaps, is both. For many, it was a prison of lost freedom. For a few, it was a ladder to power. For all, it was a world unlike any other, a world that shaped the destiny of one of history's greatest empires. The Ottoman harem was a paradox, a stage where love and betrayal danced alongside politics and diplomacy, where women lived in silence yet spoke through actions that outlived them. And though the harem itself has long since faded, its legacy endures, in stone, in story. And in the questions it continues to ask us about power, gender, and history, as we leave the echoing halls of Topkapi. Behind, one thought remains. The harem may have ended, but its secrets still whisper through history. Backhand index pointing right. But was everything we've uncovered truly the full story? Or does the harem still guard mysteries yet to be revealed?